a short time ago that President Biden will sign an executive order later today that his administration says will increase the number of background checks to buy guns. It also is expected to promote better and more secure firearm storage. This, according to the White House. But what exactly does this all mean? Let's go ahead and welcome into our show Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at the University of New Haven, Mike Lawlor. Mike, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Let's begin by just logistically breaking down what this executive order seeks to accomplish.
Well, good morning, Rain, and thanks. So what the White House is doing, what the president is announcing, is that it's not new laws, so to speak. It's doing what many people have urged him to do, which is enforce the existing laws. So, for example, one major initiative is to make sure that individuals who fit the definition of a firearms dealer are complying with the laws that govern firearms dealers. So, for example, pawn shops or auctioneers sometimes skirt the law by not complying with those laws because they don't consider themselves a firearms dealer. Firearms dealers have to do background checks when they sell firearms to people under the existing federal law. So enforcing that is an important thing. Another major initiative which he's announcing, and this kind of complements something that was done last year by the Congress in a bipartisan vote, to encourage education and awareness of red flag laws where they exist. So 19 states have them, but 31 states don't. But nonetheless, law enforcement in every state can take steps if people report to them that there's an individual who has access to guns who is posing an imminent danger to himself or to others. So it's more enforcing the existing law and encouraging law enforcement agencies and public health professionals and ordinary citizens around the country to use the laws that are on the books.
So let's dive a little bit deeper when it comes to those red flag laws, because we know that that bit of legislation, which are in 19 states, as you mentioned, it also helps to close loopholes. So in Texas, for example, just a few weeks ago, the Texas Senate passed a bill that would close a loophole in the state that allowed for gun sales to people who were involuntarily hospitalized for mental illness between the ages of 16 and 18. Now, this was the first bill passed by the Senate this year in Texas. So could you explain a little bit more how President Biden's announcement will address the issue of loopholes and those red flag laws, especially on a national level?
Well, the president cannot unilaterally change the law or add to the law, but what he is doing is encouraging people to follow the existing laws. And so under existing federal law, people who have been involuntarily committed to hospitals for treatment of mental health issues are not allowed to have guns. And so there's a number of states that really don't abide by that. And it's encouraging to hear that Texas wants to abide by these rules. Don't forget, the only way you get committed to a mental health hospital involuntarily is if a court finds that you are an imminent danger to yourself or to others, in addition to being mentally ill. So that makes perfect common sense. And I think it's the awareness of these things that helps separate people who are not responsible, not law-abiding citizens from their guns. And I think, you know, as we see each of these mass shooting tragedies, these active shooter tragedies around the country, you can see in each of these cases there were red flags ahead of time. There were warning signs. And so either people didn't reach out to the police to ask them to do something, or the police weren't aware of what options they actually had available. So this emphasis on using the existing laws is very helpful.
So this bill also includes millions of dollars for mental health, school safety, crisis intervention programs, and incentives for states to include juvenile records in the National Instant Criminal Background Check system. So some people believe that gun policy reform is the best way to address mass shootings and school safety. Others believe that mental health is a totally separate issue. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, guns don't kill people. People do. So that's often a sentiment that comes from conservatives. Obviously, no one situation is the same, but what opposition do you expect this legislation to have from Republicans or even from President Biden's fellow Democrats?
Well, it's important to keep in mind it's not actually legislation. It's an executive order to step up enforcement of existing laws. So now it is possible that that could be challenged in court somehow. I don't really see the angle that you'd have to do that, but if history is any guide, there will be people who try and derail these initiatives. But there's nothing about the president's orders today that sort of changes or adds to existing law. He's just encouraging the executive branch, the agencies that report to him, to step up their efforts in all of these regards. The other thing that's important to keep in mind, and this is just a fact, and that is persons who have mental illness are no more dangerous than people who don't have mental illness. Sometimes there is a correlation between serious mental illness and dangerousness, but the mental illness by itself is not the indicator. So that's why I think the president was very careful and not to go out of his way to stigmatize persons with mental illness. For example, I mean, if you can't sleep at night, that technically is a mental illness, but it doesn't mean you're dangerous. And you can get treatment for the sleep disorder, but again, you do have the right to own and possess firearms if you're otherwise a law-abiding citizen. So it's these distinctions that are important to keep in mind.
Why do you think the president is announcing this now?
Well, I think the president, like many Americans, is frustrated by the unwillingness of the Congress to establish nationwide laws that are similar to the laws that exist in my state, in Connecticut, and a number of other states, where you can see the level of gun violence, the firearm-related deaths, is much lower than you'd see in the parts of the country that are very sort of lax when it comes to regulating firearms. And so this is just another way to help promote the idea of universal background checks and responsible gun ownership nationwide. And it's also important to keep in mind that the biggest category of people who get killed with guns are people who are committing suicide. And many of these suicides are also murder suicides, especially in the domestic for family violence category. So the situation is much more complicated than gun violence on the street. We saw today in Harris County, Texas, a 4-year-old child was shot and killed by her 3-year-old sister because people left a gun lying around in a bedroom with easy access for children. So these are the kinds of things that are more like a public health awareness, and I think the president is trying to promote that.
Any final thoughts?
No, just my fervent hope that every state would adopt laws similar to what we have here in Connecticut, because at the end of the day, responsible gun owners have the right to have guns, but the government has an obligation to separate irresponsible, dangerous people from firearms. And I think that message is being amplified today by the president. And, the fact is, in our country, there are way more guns in circulation than there are responsible gun owners. And narrowing that gap is the goal of public policy.
All right, Mike, thank you so much for joining us here. It's been a pleasure.
Anytime, Rain. Thank you for inviting me.